strongly to agree that climate change is caused by us, human beings. Perceptions of harm, this is a very interesting thing. Most Canadians believe that Canadians are already being harmed by climate change, either a great deal or a moderate amount. But when you ask them about their personal, the personal risk that climate change poses for them, they are less inclined to say it will really affect their lives. And this has been a stubbornly intransigent data point for about 5 or 10 years now. And it's a critical one because people act when they feel threatened personally. And you see there, 15%, only 15% feel that they are likely to be harmed a great deal in their own lifetimes. In terms of blame, 77% of Canadians blame to some extent or say they has played a big role in climate change, companies that use, transport, and produce fossil fuels. But look at what the next figure is. 74%, almost the same number, blame governments for inaction. And 64% blame everybody, individuals, for not doing more. Climate-friendly behaviors, as you can see here, are not extremely common. Just 51% speak about climate change with their friends and family occasionally. 34% shop with the environment in mind, and 27% choose alternate modes of transportation. So there's movement in that area. There have been behavior changes in the last 10 years, we've noted. It's not a stampede towards public transit and not eating meat, but there's movement there. However, Canadians remain pretty unconvinced about the solutions. So when you ask them about concerns about climate change, high, but then when you get into the specifics about solutions, there's often, and particularly at this moment, there's a lot of skepticism. So this is just one solution that you've heard about, the carbon tax in Canada, carbon pricing. And this shows you where the opinions about that have gone since 2011. You see support for the carbon tax peaking shortly after it was introduced, or around about the time it was being introduced by the Liberal government. And this is federally, and this is not provincially. And you can see it's been trailing off, declining. Total support is that top line. Net support is the bottom line. So what's been happening since 2021? This is a question for you. What's happened since 2021? What do you think's behind that drop? Gas prices, so cost of living's gone up. Pierre Poilievre has been campaigning. People are very concerned about affordability. They're concerned about their own health. People have a limited budget for concern. And this is, carbon taxes suffered significantly. I think probably a lot to do with declining support for the Liberal government. So, and then stepping back from these market research data, before we go much further, I just want to draw your attention to some really serious barriers that exist to people learning more about climate change, caring more about it. So I mentioned the cost of living, healthcare, war, these kinds of things draw people's minds to other things. There are significant psychological barriers to accepting facts about climate change. This is not as easy as just arguing for what we're doing right now, the status quo. And there is some research on this now. Gail Hachachka, does anybody here know Gail Hachachka at UBC? Among others, talking about psychological barriers at sort of a deeply bedded level, a climate, what she calls a climate shadow, which is essentially a place where people shunt their concerns about climate change so they can get on with their lives and just be relatively happy people. There are also, for youth, there are a variety of very specific barriers that Gifford has referred to as the dragons of inaction. And these are things like tokenism, wanting to belong to the group, a variety of things that older folks tend to be a little bit less drawn by, but among youth, those have been identified as significant barriers. A guy called Shane Gunster at SFU has done some interesting analysis of social media networks, and he has shown how the progressive voices of climate advocates, for example, are being muted by a far more effective use of social media and its infrastructure by opponents of environmental protection. And if I would encourage you to look up Shane Gunster and some of his mapping of these networks. And it's essentially creating nodes in social media networks that package information that is useful to opponents of climate solutions and environmental protection, packaging it and distributing it through various established nodes of allies in ways that the progressive environmental movement in Canada, for example, does not do, just owing to who the folks are in the environmental movement. That's a significant thing. And then there's a very well-funded industry campaigns underway, pushing back in a coordinated way against the climate solutions that are on the table in Canada, and political campaigns that you've mentioned, you know about, that are aiming to divide us and to disinform people. So these are just other factors, and I've given you some statistics up front. I'm going to focus now, and the rest of this talk is on a recent piece of research that EcoAnalytics did in November of last year, and this was our largest segmentation to date of the Canadian population. And the segmentation basically is an assessment of in this case, the Canadian electorate in terms of their values and behavior and their beliefs about climate change, their values and behavior as those relate to climate change, and their broader beliefs and how their values influence their attitudes towards climate change. And it's a way for understanding who's out there, who you're talking to. And these data were drawn from a very large survey of over 6,000 Canadians done in November of last year by Université de Montréal researchers. The aim here was to emulate some of the research that's been done in the UK in, for example, Britain Talks Climate. Some of you may know that research that was done by Climate Outreach in the UK a few years ago, and also Yale University's values and behavior research. And I'm just going to take you on a quick flight through some of the details in this, and then I hope at the end to be able to give you a few reasons to hope. So who's out there? There are, in terms of attitudes and levels of engagement on climate change, there are 5 segments we've identified. Progressive activists, these are probably most of you, I would think, and me. They make up about 15%, and I'll give you some more details about some of these segments in a moment, but a group that we call progressive activists, these are the most engaged folks on climate change in Canada. They tend to be urban, they tend to be younger, they tend to be educated. You have university educations. We've identified a group called civic nationals, who are a very important group in that they are almost as concerned about climate change as progressive activists. I'll tell you a bit more about them in a moment. They tend to be women. They tend to be have high school educations, and often not higher than high school educations. They're very community focused. They're car dependent. Centrist liberals are folks who are socially liberal and fiscally conservative. They believe in business and markets. In different parts of Canada, they lean left or right. In British Columbia, they lean right. In the East, they tend to lean left of center. Disengaged middle, this is like 3 out of 10 Canadians. And they are the least engaged of all. Tell you more about them. And fossil fuel conservatives. These are the diehard supporters of the oil and gas industry. And they're people who tend to work at the industry. They tend to be men. They tend to be conservative voting. So progressive activists, these are the folks who are ready and ready to mobilize. The environmental movement in Canada, who I serve, the main NGOs in Canada reach about 6%. Only 6% of Canadians actually support NGOs. And yet 15% of the electorate are progressive activists. So this is an opportunity for NGOs. It identifies, there's a larger public out there who can be reached if you figure out how to do it. I mentioned to you they tend to be younger, female, upper middle class, university educated. They're the least car-dependent group. They're concerned about health, climate, and inflation, in addition to social justice issues, et cetera. And there are narratives we've developed to test with these different groups, but I'm not going to go into that. The civic nationals. And this number here, I realize it says 19%. They're actually 21%. That's an error between 2 versions of this. That's over 1 in 5 Canadians are civic nationals. They tend to be concentrated in Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces. They're older, female, with lower incomes and a high school education, as I mentioned. Very interesting, their values convict, what we call values conflicted. So they're very concerned about climate change. They are very interested in supporting their communities, and yet they are inclined to be opposed to high levels of immigration. They are inclined to support more authoritarian points of view. These folks vote for all 3 of the major parties, Conservative, Liberal, and NDP, depending on where you are in the country. In BC, they tend to vote NDP. In Ontario and in the Atlantic provinces, they tend to vote Conservative. They are a group that is available and receptive to climate messaging if you put the right people in front of them and you're careful about how you speak to them. Now, this is just to show you that that segmentation I've been showing you is based on values and related to climate change. If you ask these people about their political and social values expressly, you're not focusing on climate change right now, there's a different mix, and these numbers are slightly different you see here, but you'll see that the civic nationals are towards the bottom of the heap in terms of their attitudes on political and social issues. They tend to be quite socially conservative. And it's important to keep this in mind because I'm going to be suggesting ways that you get to civic nationals later. So on egalitarianism and free market ideology, look at the graph on the left. On your left, first, discrimination against minorities is still a very serious problem in our society. You'll see that the civic nationals are fairly high on that. They tend to agree with that, compared with fossil fuel conservatives, for example. Asked about government ownership of industry, to respond to the assertion, government ownership of industry should be increased. You'll see that, and what you're seeing on the right there, the y-axis, is the percentage who disagree with this assertion, that government ownership of industry should be increased. And you'll see that among fossil fuel conservatives, there's the highest opposition to increases in government ownership of industry. And you'll see on the left-hand side, interestingly, civic nationals are very close to progressive activists in terms of their support for government ownership of industry, or tendency not to oppose that. On populism, this is an interesting one. There are 2 sort of markers of populism here that one on the left, and on the right you're looking at nationalism. But on the left, I'd rather put my trust in the common sense of ordinary people than in experts and intellectuals. This is a populist point of view. And you'll see that civic nationals are much more likely to agree with that than progressive activists or even centrist liberals, for example. So this is a very specific group with its own set of values, and they need to be, you need to talk to them in certain ways. So some takeaways just from talking about values and so far in this. The primary audiences for climate communicators are probably progressive activists and civic nationals and centrist liberals. A secondary audience, however, and I'll tell you a bit more about them in a moment, is this disengaged middle. Some of you will have heard the term movable middle. We're no longer using the term movable middle because we've got a much better idea about who's in there. And that the movable middle, what used to be called the movable middle, includes everybody from civic nationals to disengaged middle. Okay, and that's the majority of Canadians. Some are much more movable than other parts of that. And with these three main primary groups, and to some extent with disengaged middle, you can use egalitarian messaging that touches on folks' belief in fairness, for example. So a statement like profit-driven corporations and governments are fueling climate change would work with all three of those segments, as would promote pollution pricing paid by corporations, so rather than consumers. In other words, a climate tax, a carbon tax that is placed on industry first and not consumers first. So there's been a declining support for the Liberals' carbon pricing, carbon tax. A way that you might challenge and yet provide support for carbon pricing is to suggest that the emphasis be put mainly on industry, and industry be the polluter pay, essentially. Some other takeaways on this, tailor your messaging different for different reachable segments, obviously. Civic nationals, you might say we need strong government action against corporations acting unfairly, polluting unfairly. With civic centrist liberals, you probably want to try a frame along the lines of that emphasizes the positive benefits for business of the energy transition, so business opportunities. Frame your messages in ways that activate progressives' pride too. All three of these segments I've talked to you about are very proud to be Canadian, and so find ways that you can talk to their nationalist patriotic tendencies. And one way to do that is to use green nationalist messaging, as has been done in Quebec. I can talk to you a bit about that afterwards if you're interested in knowing more. Okay, I'm talking. Are there any immediate burning questions that anybody wants to ask? Something that doesn't make sense to you? Okay, Zoomers, ask questions in the chat, I guess, or in the question and answer if you want me to field or stop. Okay. So areas of common ground in this research. There is surprisingly strong support for the statement, there is too much foreign control over Canadian natural resources. I'm old enough to remember when economic nationalism was owned by the left. And in Canada, nationalism was something that left-leaning parties essentially were in control of. Today, the nationalist messaging coming out of Pierre Poilievre and others is not being countered effectively by the left. There is room for progressive voices to talk about the amount of Canada's oil resource that is owned abroad. That's one way that you might talk to these particular progressive segments. There is a social license to tax oil and gas and tax it much more heavily, tax industry much more heavily. And you see that what this graph just shows you is the degree of support for increasing taxes on oil and gas companies. And among progressive activists, you see it's highest. But among civic nationals, look at that, strong support for it. And among centrist liberals, and these are folks who are business friendly, there's strong support. Only among fossil fuel conservatives do you see disagreement, strong disagreement with that. There is a conservation coalition that could be encouraged among all different segments, and it's around, this is one example of it, this statement, do you support or oppose rezoning protected land to allow more homes and roads to be built? Okay, now on what you're seeing there is the level of disagreement with that. Okay, so a lot of people are not willing to take lands out of the green belt or out of the ALR, and people right across the political spectrum, across these segments. So that's an area in which environmentalists and climate activists can develop and build a constituency. And then there may be a clean energy coalition as well. You see support for development of the renewable energy on the left-hand side of that graph, opposition to it on the right. So takeaways around common ground. Talk about the value of a strong tech sector, and various segments agree on the value of a strong tech sector. You could promote narratives around, for example, clean energy includes renewable energy and electrification. Innovation is clean. Renewable energy, et cetera, is something that we need to further invest in. And countering greenwashing about, quote, clean fossil fuels and the merits of carbon capture and sequestration. This is a dodgier one, but environmental organizations are thinking about this after a long time of sort of keeping it at arm's length, but going populist. So the sort of messaging around foreign control of the tar sands is populist. And there are majorities in all segments who agree with the statement, or all of the segments we want to reach, progressive activists, civic nationals, and centrist liberals, that the system is rigged to serve the rich and powerful. Now, given that the conservatives are making hay with their social media campaigns, that might sound counterintuitive to you. But if you look at their messaging, it's strongly populist and tries to identify climate action as being against the little guy, as opposed to makes life more expensive, is essentially these are policies of the rich elite, that sort of thing. There are ways to undermine those kinds of messages with your own populist messaging. Populist frames emphasizing too much foreign control over Canada's natural resources could be very useful in mobilizing action against industry lobbies and using appropriate messengers to raise awareness about high levels of foreign ownership in Canada's oil and gas sector. I'm going to say a word more about who those messengers are in a moment. And then you may be able to build coalitions of voters around conservation and clean energy issues, as I noted. Okay, so NGOs. I work on behalf of non-governmental organizations, nonprofit, environmental organizations. Look at this graph, and you'll see the degree to which these groups are not reaching beyond their immediate choir. So progressive activists, what you're seeing here, folks who identify as being active participants, sympathetic or yet inactive, in sympathetic environmental organizations yet inactive, neutral, unsympathetic, or active opponents. And the dark green is active participants. and the light green are sympathetic and inactive. You'll see that the progressive activists are by far most inclined to support NGOs. Civic nationals are not nearly as active, but still fairly sympathetic. Centrist liberals, less active still, but still fairly sympathetic. And then among disengaged middle, you see just they're not paying attention. These are folks who, I'll tell you a bit more in a sec, but they're very preoccupied by financial concerns or not politically engaged and not following messaging on this sort of thing. So it's critical that climate communicators find messengers who are trusted by these different segments. This is this graph shows you. Is it something I need to do? This is the most difficult slide to see too, so I'll just tell you about it. Basically, it shows that among progressive activists, there is, and among civic nationals, there's a lot of support for doctors and scientists as messengers. And yet there are, and there's declining support for, there's declining trust in NGOs as you go down, the United Nations, Government of Canada, media, and the Canadian oil and gas industry is right down the bottom in terms of progressive activists. It shows, oh, you've got it now, good. Look at the friends on the left-hand side. This is perhaps the most salient point on this graph. Among all groups, people strongly trust friends. Now, who are friends? Who do you think friends are? What's meant by friends here? Could be people you know. It could be people who are you're friendly with on social media. And but the valence of what that means needs to be unpacked. For certain people, trusting friends could mean one thing and quite a different thing for others. Obviously, that's a challenge for organizations that regularly refer and cite experts or government officials or doctors, for example. But you'll see that doctors and scientists do fairly well right across the segments. The oil industry doesn't do very well, and Government of Canada is government by and large is much lower on that in terms of level of trust. Have I got 5 minutes left? It's 30. Yeah. I'd like to get to some questions, so I'm gonna go fairly swiftly through these last slides. This just shows that we've mapped the voting intentions of each of these segments, and you'll see that look at the civic nationals in there. They're spread right across the map, whereas fossil fuel conservatives are fairly true blue. The disengaged middle. What I'd like to say here is almost half of this segment, which represents 3 out of 10 Canadians, are concerned about climate change and are potentially within reach. If you can find ways to cut through the noise, to mute concerns about the economy and anxiety around around affordability, et cetera, or to tie in messaging about climate that refers to its benefits for healthcare, cost of living, and those sorts of things. There are 2 other segments within this group. The civic middle of this disengaged middle is also reachable. They're the most politically involved, the most inclined to vote. The least inclined to vote is the concerned middle, okay, which is a bit surprising, but these are younger, they tend to be younger, they tend to be people of color in Canada. They're the most likely of all the segments to be people of color in Canada. These are folks who are struggling just to get by and they're the most inclined to have families too. Young children, I should say. So engaging the concerned middle, I'm going to skip over this because there's too much to say right here. And they are, but basically I touched on some of the things you could do. I'd like to get to your questions. I've talked about this, I've talked about that. Points of hope. Canadians care about climate change. They want governments to act. There is common ground among these segments. There are opportunities to communicate with new audiences. These civic nationals are, they're not a new audience. We've just identified them as right now as being available and being willing to talk. And there are creative ways of getting to civic nationals, even by NGOs. We need to test different frames. We need to amplify the voices of new spokespeople who are trusted by the different segments. We may need to bundle issues together. The Biden administration's big climate bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, was a giant bundling effort. It took climate change, climate action, and it bundled it together with social security, education, all kinds of different issues. And it succeeded in passing a raft of very progressive measures. That may be something that needs to be done here. And then upbeat messages tend to, as you probably know, tend to work better than messages of despair. So I think that's everything I want to say to you. This is just a bit about eco-analytics. If you're interested in this kind of research, we publish everything freely on our website, and we have a very good database. And you see a link right there at the bottom. And these are some of the organizations that are our members. And that's that. Thank you for, yeah. I think so. So where the, no, I really want to know how to engage. Okay. I'm just going to go back to that slide. I think we're talking about the concerned this. I don't know, is it possible to communicate with the person who posed this question? I'm not sure whether they're talking, I think they're talking about the disengaged middle. Okay, so I'm going to assume, is it Mary? So talking to the concerned middle, think about your audience. They are younger, they are, they tend to be people of color. Among all these segments, they're most likely to be people of color. They have families. They are snowed by all the responsibilities of just making a living and caring for their families. And they're also listening to this distant but yet constant discussion of climate change. They're hearing this term climate change. Some of their friends are concerned about it, very concerned about it, and they're concerned about their children's future. So I'm going to just flip. I hope this is of some help. And this slide deck is going to be made available to everybody so they can look there. But 30% identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. They're difficult to reach for the reasons I mentioned. Yet they're paradoxically most engaged on environmental behaviors while being held back by economic concerns and doubts about moving away from fossil fuels. So you're going to need to open up a conversation which talks about those doubts and fears around transitioning away from fossil fuels, what the economic opportunities are, what the job opportunities are, what the downside of, if you're in the Okanagan, obviously wildfires would be something you would want to refer to. Be aware, though, too, that many folks don't make the connection still between climate change and extreme weather. A lot of people do not see a direct link between those things. So you're going to need to unpack the issue and talk about it in a sensitive way. You need to address economic anxiety. You need to appeal to a younger identity. So there are a whole lot of things that you would do when speaking to younger Canadians that you might not do when talking to older Canadians. And then the populist messaging is also something that's available to you.